everyone, Professor King here. In this video, I'm going to be talking about Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own and relating that theoretical text to chapter 7 of Isabel Allende's Eva Luna. So make sure you've read both of those before you watch this video so that you can understand the questions that I'm asking. And always remember to pause and reflect where you need to, or if you need to catch up to pause. And also always remember that when questions arise, to contact me as soon as possible. All right, so as usual, I'm just going to dive right into the PowerPoint here. So I'll take it to a share screen. And let me go to the slideshow. So again, we're talking about Shakespeare's Sister. It's a short kind of essay chapter out of a larger book called A Room of One's Own by Virginia Woolf. Virginia Woolf, who is a early to mid 20th century modernist writer. I'll talk a little bit about her right here. So Virginia Woolf, that's her. That's there she is right there. She was from a notable blended family of artists by the last name Stephen, Duckworth, and Thackeray. I believe it was her father was married multiple times, I think because of widowing in his life. And, so he was a well-known artist and publisher, and his family, and I think the wife whose family he married into, they were all kind of these like famous artist people. So she grew up for her time very privileged in the sense that she came from wealth, and she was also allowed into certain intellectual circles that the average woman of her time would not have been included in. And I think, when we read A Room of One's Own, she definitely acknowledges the historical phenomenon of like not just the barriers to women, right, of access to certain groups or levels of society, but also the barriers to the poor, the working class, people with mental illness, things that Woolf was sort of very interested in throughout her reading. If you've ever read, like Mrs. Dalloway is probably her most famous book. She looks at all those same things in that book, right? She looks at things like gender. She looks at things like trauma recovery. She looks at things like wealth, right, versus lack thereof, perspective. She's also, I'll talk about this in a moment, but she also pioneers stream of consciousness. How her writing first kind of came about was she was part of the Bloomsbury group, which was a group of intellectuals that would get together in these sort of like salons and discuss, art and culture. And she started Hogarth Press. Again, very, very sort of prolific in the literary arts, right? She did have an affair with her dear friend Vita Sackville West. So her queerness and her bisexuality are something that have come up in a lot of various biographies and sort of analyses of her. And that's definitely, something that can be considered when we look at some of her work. She was both, an artist in terms of, she wrote novels and short stories and things of that nature. But she also wrote theory, right? So this example that we're reading today is an example of her theory, right? A Room of One's Own and works like that. So as I mentioned, she was sort of a pioneer, at least in terms of literature, of psychoanalysis and of a style of writing called stream of consciousness. And you see that style somewhat in this reading in Shakespeare's Sister. But again, if you've read any of her work like To the Lighthouse or Mrs. Dalloway or The Waves, The Waves less so, but you really see that sort of stream of consciousness. And what we mean by stream of consciousness is writing that reflects the way that the brain operates. So you'll see these really long, seemingly nonsensical sort of sentences that are clearly like run-ons and fragments, so they don't work grammatically, but the pacing of it, the rhythm of the writing is meant to imitate the way that the brain sort of develops ideas, thoughts, language, etc. So if you're reading her writing, you're like, oh, geez, Professor King is so hard on my sentences. And, you know, look at this broad who's just run on after run on of stream of consciousness writing. It's intentional, right? And she knew the rules in order to break them. And that's what she's doing, right? And you see this a lot in particularly British modernists and their work. So Virginia Woolf, Samuel Beckett, even though T.S. Eliot was technically American, he kind of adopted that British, literally the citizenship, but also that sort of persona. And so you see a lot of stream of consciousness in his work. So this was a really kind of big deal. Again, a pioneering writing style at the time of Virginia Woolf. She was also a trauma survivor and dealt with a variety of mental health issues, you know, both presumably as a result of her trauma survival, but also, you know, she could have been biologically inclined to these issues. So, you know, I'm not here to kind of give the nature or nurture discussion. This isn't a science class. But if we think about how her trauma survival affected her outlook, we can definitely read what she has to say from that lens, right? So she was very close to her mother, and at the age of 13, her mother passed away, which is that's why her father got remarried, because her mother passed away. So, you know, she had to deal with the loss of a parent at age 13. And then she was actually raped by her brother, her much older brother. I believe he was in his early to mid 20s when she was 14. And that had clearly a very devastating effect on her. She eventually died by suicide in her late 60s because it was during the time of World War II. She honestly believed that, you know, that England was not going to survive the war, and that the world would be thrown into, you know, the pits of fascism. And so really her death was kind of a way to circumvent what she foresaw as like further torture. At least that's kind of the general, like, broad explanation, other than her clear experience with depression and things like that, and trauma survival. But so mental health issues are also something that you'll see a lot of in her work, right? With Mrs. Dalloway, we have a character like Septimus Warren, who can kind of be seen in some ways as like a male personification of some of these things. So, all right, let's move on. So let's think about the text itself, about Shakespeare's sister. In some places, you'll see it called If Shakespeare Had a Sister. Because again, this is like excerpted from a larger work, so sometimes the title changes slightly. So Woolf talks about Judith Shakespeare, and she gives this hypothetical fictional Judith Shakespeare a biography, right? I want you to consider that biography and what Woolf is saying overtly, but also implying, right, about Judith's life and about why Judith Shakespeare has this life that she does, and what could have been different had her birth been under different circumstances in terms of gender, class, etc. Right? So think about things like tone, think about the information that Woolf provides versus what she doesn't tell us, right? Text versus subtext. The implications of either the information that she includes or what she leaves out, etc. Right? And then Woolf goes into this on page 897 of the second edition. She goes into this sort of, or maybe it's 1897. I'll double check that. She goes into this whole sort of monologue about how she agrees with this deceased archbishop. I believe she's referring to Trevelyan. Um, and she talks about, um, exactly like what would have happened to a woman had she been gifted with, the intellectual and artistic genius of Shakespeare, um, but lived at his time as a woman, right? And so, um, think about that discussion in that paragraph. She begins the paragraph saying like, "I agree with the deceased bishop," and then she launches into this whole like explanation of why she agrees. And I want you to think about what the point of that discussion is. Is she saying, in other words, is she saying like women just aren't as smart as men, or is she getting at something a bit more systemic, right? A bit deeper, a bit more like she refers to, a bit more like a web, right? She talks about that web symbol at the beginning of this reading. And I think that's such a helpful visual, right? That it's not one thing, it's not, sort of a domino effect, it's a web, right? And so thinking about those ideas, kind of letting them simmer all around. I hope this is making sense. I'm trying to explain it without giving too much away because clearly you're supposed to do the reading. Okay. When you read this, think about all the theorists we've read so far, right? And think about if any other theorists come to mind when you're reading this, or just contemporary examples of this kind of stuff, right? Um, take a moment. Maybe this is a good time to pause and think about these questions. And then finally, Woolf in this reading and in the broader text, she advocates for the inclusion of more female writers because she has this whole discussion about like, it's weird that all this literature created by men, right? Like these women are amazing and queens and heroines, and they don't happen very often, right? But they're like these magnificent figures, and yet when we actually look at the history of what women were allowed and not allowed to do, and who they were allowed to be and who they weren't, we don't, there's a disconnect there. Um, and we don't really ever see the internality, right? The internal landscape of women themselves, especially if they're like working class, right? Um, and so when she's talking about all this, right? Like, and if we think about it in terms of Isabel Allende, a female writer writing a novel now, and Allende's after Woolf, right? But if we think about it now in terms of the 20th into the 21st century, why is it so important that we have women writers writing about women, or women writers just writing about the world, right? The way that we see the world. And why does Woolf advocate that female artists need, quote, excuse me, a room of, she calls it a room of one's own, but why does the female artist need a room of her own? And this is a symbolic room, right? Like we're not talking about like, I need an office, right? Like, I mean, literally, yeah, but this space, we'll call it this space, right, of our own. Why would female writers or artists need that? So take a moment to think about those and maybe pause, jot down some answers, and then we'll move on. All right, so again, think about the web, right? And a Venn diagram in a way is kind of like, it's kind of like a web, or it's like a nest, right? It's like taking all these disparate things and kind of putting them together and seeing where they overlap. But think about the Venn diagram, or copy the Venn diagram that you see here in your notes, and consider how these identity markers can intersect, right? What effect that could have on an artist, an individual, history, right? The way that we read history, the way that we experience the world, right? Um, when we talk about critical thinking, especially in the 104 class, one of the things we have to remember is that critical thinking is the ability to get outside of ourselves, right? To see the world from a different perspective. and to understand that there are, with any given situation, there are multiple perspectives through which we can view a text, we can view an argument, we can view a scenario, right? We can view the world. So where was I going with that? Oh, okay. So you know, at sort of the heart of critical thought is our ability to step outside ourselves. And so when we're able to step outside of ourselves and at least attempt to look at the world from a perspective that we're not used to, then we are engaging in critical thought, right? And I think for me specifically, gender is always a great example of this, because I tend to see, and I'm not saying that anywhere near all male students are guilty of this. This is not the case. But I tend to see when I start talking about gender in my classes, this phenomenon, and it's fascinating. What will happen is students, there will be a small subset of students who identify as male. Again, not all the students who identify as male, but there will be a small subset when I begin discussions of gender where they just won't read any of the readings. It's like their brain shuts off to them. They just won't even go there. And I've even had students say something to the effect of, can I not write this essay on gender, right? Because, you know, and the reasons kind of, at least to me, they don't really ever make sense. But, you know, there's this idea that we don't have to acknowledge that, right? Like there's this idea that this makes me uncomfortable, or it challenges my worldview, or you know, somewhere along the line, I've kind of decided that I'm just not going to agree with what I think that this text is going to say. So I'm just going to ignore it, right? And that's so dangerous. It's so dangerous for those students because, again, like I said, what inevitably ends up happening is when students are forced to read those kinds of texts that they have all these presuppositions about, that they think are going to be about one thing, but turn out to be totally about something else, is they learn so much and they have these aha moments where they go, oh my gosh, like I have experienced that, right? Like I do understand that. This does make sense. And shutting that critical thought process off, again, of looking at things from somebody else's perspective, it disallows the student, the reader, the thinker to expand that part of their brain, right? You know, it's the same thing with politics. It's the same thing with understanding the world from, you know, the perspective of someone from a different socioeconomic status, right? Or a different mental health status. Like every time we do that, every time we say, no thanks, we are doing ourselves a disservice, because that level of discomfort that we're going to get into in that, you know, wandering through that sort of mire of, I don't know, this is too political for me, or this is too gender-based for me, or this is too, you know, sexually oriented for me, or whatever, right? We're doing ourselves a disservice. We're cutting ourselves off from that. So every time we get that impulse, let's fight against it. And I'm, you know, I am in the same boat. There are things where I'm like, I don't want to read this, you know, this drivel. And then I read it and I'm like, oh, okay, that expanded my mind in some way, right? So I'm not saying that anyone has a monopoly on feeling that way. But what I'm saying is when we start to feel that pulling back, that's when we should push forward most. Okay, anyway, I'll keep going. All right, so let's think about some basics from chapter 7, and then we'll go into some more critical thinking type questions. So after having read chapter 7, you should be able to answer the following questions. 1, be able to describe the political atmosphere that, you know, that the picture that Allende paints politically, right, of all the stuff that's going on in chapter 7. And then think about Rolf Carlé, right? Rolf Carlé kind of has come in and out of this novel because, again, it's picaresque, so it's episodic, so we're kind of bouncing back and forth between people's lives. But Rolf Carley comes back in chapter 7, right? And Rolf works for somebody, we'll say. So what's Rolf Carley's job now, right? And for whom does Rolf work, and why might that be important? Think about characters we've already met, but that Rolf Carley meets, and his sort of understanding of them, right? How he sees them perhaps similarly or differently to us or to other characters in the novel. And then finally, there is a description of like the life of a guerrilla fighter, right? Why is our narrator, or Allende, right? Because Allende's writing this novel, right? Why might the guerrilla fighter's life have been described in that way? Again, what's Allende, who's creating this world, creating this text? What's she getting us, trying to get us to think, feel, believe, or consider? Okay. So once you have those basics, right, then we can kind of move on to the next set of questions, which are going to be a little more higher level thinking. So if you don't, if you read quickly and maybe skipped over some of this, go back and figure out what the answers to these are. Again, pause it and then come back. All right. So let's talk about the novel and Woolf, right? So I want you to think back to the Venn diagram I had you do, not in the first half of this class, but kind of earlier on in these in these slides, right? Think about female characters we've been introduced to. Clearly, we have Eveluna, right? We have Sulema. We have Eva's mom, right? We have any number of female characters that we've met so far, right? So I want you to think about one that has stuck out to you in particular. Maybe you love this female character, maybe you hate this female character. And I want you to maybe just brainstorm really quickly a Venn diagram of your own where you think about where this character falls in terms of gender, in terms of race, in terms of class, in terms of mental health status, in terms of sexuality, or in terms of any combination, right? And how those identity markers have affected that character's life, right? If this character is female and born poor, that's going to be very different than, like the life of, say, somebody like Professor Jones, who was like born super wealthy and Euro and male, right? So think about, given all of these identity markers, all of these characterizations of this particular character, how might that character's life have been different had she been born male, or even had she been born wealthy, or of a different mental health status, or, of a different race, whatever. Think about how things could have turned out differently, right? Because again, it's that web, it's those combinations and permutations of who we are, right? Who our identity is, and how that shapes, one, how we see the world, but also how we navigate within that world, right? And then how the world perceives us back. All right, so you might want to pause it here and do a little brainstorm, and then I'll move on. All right. And then finally, again, just like continuing this wedding, right, of thinking about Woolf and thinking about chapter 7, right? Why the chapter on the political climate of South America? Does gender have anything to do with that? According to Allende, right, what appears to be the difference between dictatorship and democracy? And think about the tone and the attitude of the people. Allende has this great sense of humor. It's a very kind of like dark or sardonic sense of humor. But sometimes that is to facilitate these very difficult discussions of very scary things, right? Like proto-fascism and war and violence and, death and all of these things. So think about all of those, right? And then we have Uberto, right? And Uberto, given what we know about Uberto, right, we see in this chapter that he starts to feel compassion, right? And we know what he's gone through. And so why do you think he begins to feel that compassion given his life, right? And again, maybe thinking about it within the context of gender norms, of gender roles, of gender conditioning, right? Especially within, a country on the, battling the forces of dictatorship with democracy or whatever you want, however you want to think about it. So, and you can even throw in some some thoughts about our contemporary American culture that draw parallels to that if you want. Um, but yeah, so these are the questions to think of, and then the discussion board will be up on Canvas. I'm gonna take it off the share screen now. I hope that this was helpful. Again, if you have any questions, ooh, there's a little big fat fly on the screen. If you have any questions, just please feel free to contact me. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day and evening. Bye.